next speaker up and going here, which is Dr. David Brown, who is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Eastern Kentucky University. And he will be speaking about the topic that you can see right there on the slide already, hopefully. So go ahead, Dr. Brown.
Okay, thanks, Matt, and thanks to the executive committee for pulling this meeting together. I know we're all getting sick of the virtual, and hopefully we can get back together soon and have a real in-person meeting. I noticed in the bios, they're not actually auto bios, or at least mine wasn't, because if I had written it myself, I would have included another really important thing about me, and that is that I really like to play Foursquare, and we all play Foursquare at the state meeting every year, so it's kind of a disappointment not to have that going on. So getting into the core of the presentation here, so a lot of the material I'm going to present here has been presented at other state meetings in the past, usually by some of our students who have talked about components of this kind of bigger project. And each of the methods, I'm going to describe several assessment methods, and each one of them has gone through a development process spanning multiple generations of students and agency scientists. So it's been a decade-long process to pull together all these methods, and they're actually still kind of in a draft mode, so they're not officially available for kind of use in regulatory processes, but at least one of them, the Kentucky rapid assessment method, kind of the core method that I'll talk about, is it is available on the DOW website, and I will make that available in the chat, the link to that after the presentation. So wetlands, we know, are incredibly diverse and complex. You know, they span kind of the aquatic and terrestrial systems. As Dr. Richter mentioned, they're wet and they're land. They're found in many regions, and they have different types of structures and functions. So they're complex, and given that, it's fair to ask, how well do you know the wetlands that you manage or that you use? Well, Lee Fredrickson, important wildlife, waterfowl, wetland ecologist, he suggests that you need to spend 10,000 hours on a bucket in a wetland to really understand wetland biology and wetland management. Here's my bucket. I'm getting ready to go out in a wetland after all this presentations. So, however, as a manager of a wetland, it's often difficult to spend 10,000 hours at a time in wetlands. And usually we're in a situation where we need to quickly learn about a wetland. We need to, in a short amount of time, assess that wetland and the condition or quality of the wetland. So wetland assessments do just that. They measure the condition or quality or the functional integrity of a wetland. And these can be used in a variety of situations. They can be used in regulation as part of mitigation. They might be useful in easements, such as Kathy was discussing just recently, or in incentives programs like that as well. They might also be useful for monitoring, whether it's kind of long-term monitoring, ambient monitoring of wetlands. And they might also serve as a research tool to address questions and learn new things about wetlands. So there's a variety of programs out there that classify wetlands like HGM and Cowardin systems. There's a national wetland inventory. But what we're talking about here with assessments is kind of more specific, specifically looking at kind of the condition and quality. So it can be used kind of to complement some of those other tools that are out there. Okay, so I'm going to describe wetland assessment methods for Kentucky, 3 different types, and each of those types is kind of scaled to a different level. So We'll first talk about the landscape scale assessments, and then the rapid assessment. That's like the core method that I talked about that is available at the DOW website, and then intensive index of biotic integrity methods. So first, the landscape scale. So all of these different scales actually can be kind of combined or used independently, and they can also be used to develop one another and to validate one another. So at the landscape scale, in Kentucky, we've developed something that we call a disturbance indicator. We don't call it an index because as an indicator, it really is specific to kind of the data set that goes into it. So you can't just take a new wetland site and calculate the disturbance index value. You have to take a new site and combine it with lots of other sites and kind of go through the analysis process again. So it has a few more hurdles to use than some of the other methods. This landscape disturbance indicator, it requires that you're adept with GIS and also statistics. When we've developed this, we've gone through a couple iterations of this, but in the most recent one, we included 256 sites from across Kentucky. So it was developed using a statewide data set. The primary sources of data for this disturbance indicator are the National Land Cover data set, the most recent version of that. And basically we select a 1,000 meter buffer that goes around the perimeter of each of those wetlands. And then we extract the proportion of cover of each of the land cover classes from that buffer. We collapse those classes a little bit and eliminate some of the ones that don't exist in Kentucky. But in general, we're using the National Land Cover to describe at kind of a large scale, 1,000 meter buffer, what the disturbances are and what the natural habitat looks like around that wetland. So we also include in this disturbance indicator a field visit where we develop a stressor checklist that includes stressors like ditching, or has there been any clear cutting, or there are other alterations to the hydrology, or are there invasive species in the wetland? So that gets added in as another variable. And then we roll all that together in an ordination analysis, a principal components analysis. So you can see on the figures on the right where the lower left buffer is mostly disturbed. The wetland has mostly disturbed landscape around it, and then the buffer on the right is a wetland that's embedded in a more natural forested wetland. So the disturbance indicator values differ based on, and they range from 1 to 10 based on how much natural or disturbed habitat there is, and then also how many stressors that we found during the site visit. So here's a representation, a graph showing the patterns of the sites that we included in this analysis, and you can see that on the upper right, the natural wetlands, the higher quality wetlands, they all kind of cluster together. The lower quality wetlands that have more development, more stressors, and agriculture in the landscape are all also clustering together. Okay, so again, this is it's a tool that might not be as readily available and easy to use, but it does help us see kind of a big picture, especially when we want to quickly assess many wetlands across a large scale like the entire state of Kentucky. All right, so we'll next talk about the rapid assessment method, the Kentucky RAM. So this is kind of the middle level scale. The rapid assessment method has been validated and used at 457 sites across Kentucky over the last decade. The personnel that and the type of skills needed to use it are pretty basic. You need a general knowledge of wetlands and some experience in different types of wetlands in Kentucky. And you need to take a training workshop with the Kentucky Division of Water. The method itself is designed to be applied or used in a day or less, so that in a single visit to a site, you can fill out most of the information that would go into scoring that wetland using this method. It requires a field visit, basically. It also requires some desktop work, some basic GIS, some other database work to determine if there's endangered or threatened species at the site. There's a guidance manual to go along with this method, and it includes lots of details about determining what the appropriate assessment area is. And then this method, because it's been developed statewide and all the different river basins of the state, it's useful in almost all types of wetlands as well. We've used it in many types of wetlands, and they collectively kind of went into the development process. All right, so let's take a look at some of the details of this method. It's composed of 6 metrics, and you can see the list of metrics there. They include a wide variety of characteristics of a wetland that might reflect many of the different functions of the wetland. So this method is specifically designed to capture a broad range of functions in a kind of hybrid qualitative, quantitative approach. So metrics include things like the size of the wetland, the surrounding land use, hydrology, which is heavily emphasized and receives more points than some of the other metrics, and then measurements of alterations to the habitat and measurements of the plant community and the relative quality for amphibians of the site. So I'm not going to show you every metric in detail. There's kind of one page of it shown here, showing kind of the first metric, and it gives you an idea of kind of the process you go through in assigning scores for each of the metrics. And together, those 6 metrics total up 100 possible points. And then that has been divided then, those 100 possible points, into 3 categories. So we come out with a low, medium, and high category system that is useful, I think, to managers and regulators to kind of better fit it into context with how it compares to other wetlands and how it might be scored basically just on its condition. So this method has been validated in multiple ways using other assessment methods, and it's out there, and you can contact me or Stephen Richter or Michelle Gaduli-Cook at DOW to kind of learn more about it, to learn about the possibility for training sessions for these, for this particular method, the rapid assessment method. Just as an example of how this method is used, we did a study statewide a few years ago and showed that there's kind of a gradient of quality or condition of wetlands across the state, where wetlands in the western part of the state tend to be higher quality and higher condition. So category 3, that's the highest condition in the Kentucky RAM. And if you look at the overall distribution of wetlands that we included in this study, there's a lot of moderate quality wetlands. There's relatively few really high quality wetlands. And it's kind of an interesting pattern that there's a lot of moderate quality wetlands because they've probably been subjected to some types of disturbance, and there's relatively few that are pristine and in kind of the best condition. So that's just an example of how this tool might be used, but it could potentially also be used in like a mitigation process. So next I'm going to shift towards talking about the intensive methods, and it turns out we actually have three intensive methods, and these are for use in kind of more complex situations. For instance, when the rapid assessment method indicates that the condition is borderline between two categories, so that it's kind of right on the border of a Category 1 and Category 2 wetland, or a Category 2 and Category 3, or if it turns out to be a Category 3 wetland and you're interested in knowing why, what is it about this wetland that makes it a really high quality, you might turn to these intensive methods for basically more information about the site. So the intensive method approach that we developed were indexes of biotic integrity. Many of you might be familiar with these for fish and streams. In wetlands, it turns out that the taxonomic group kind of best for IBIs or vegetation. And then we also developed IBIs for avian and amphibian communities. There are other approaches to intensive assessment, such as looking for indicator species. There's also approaches that focus on physical functions like geohydrology. But for this kind of round of assessment development, our focus was on using IBIs and using it on these three taxonomic groups. So I'll talk separately about the sampling approaches and what we found in kind of the validation process for each of these three IBIs. But I first want to just go over quickly the process of developing these IBIs that we used, and it's common across all three of the methods. So this gets into some real nerdy dirt here, because if you don't really know a lot about IBIs or statistics, some of this stuff isn't necessarily important, but those of you who are into that stuff, here's a little bit for you. So all three of these methods are based first on an intensive field survey that usually takes a day, potentially more, and actually less with the bird surveys. But an intensive field survey where you're identifying all the species within the taxonomic group that you detect, and then measuring either the abundance, or in the case of plants, the cover of each of those species. And then you're doing that across many sites, so hundreds of sites that were used in the development process. So you don't need to use hundreds of sites to apply this. Since it's been developed, you can just take it, go to a single wetland, do an assessment, and kind of plug in the values that you find and get a score and a category ranking for an individual site. So using that method, that data on the abundance and the species present, we calculate a whole bunch of metrics. Many of these are based on the coefficient of conservatism, which is a measure of each species' sensitivity or tolerance to disturbance. For instance, we worked mainly Stephen Richter and Jacob Stark, one of his graduate students, and a committee of herpetologists worked to develop these values for Kentucky for the herps. And so as an example, an American bullfrog has a C of C value of 2, and a marbled salamander is much more sensitive to disturbance and has a C of C value of 7. So lots of the metrics that we calculate are based on life history guilds and their sensitivity or tolerance. So then we take all a big pool of possible metrics and work through a process of selecting the best metrics that really reflect disturbance. And we compare them to our landscape disturbance indicator. We eliminate collinear metrics. We make sure each metric has like a suitable range of values. And then we take the remaining kind of list of candidate metrics that are related to the indicator, and we combine them and go through a model selection process to find the combination that is kind of most complementary. So let's take a look here at the vegetation IBI. We developed this with 112 sites located statewide. It requires a highly skilled botanist or multiple botanists working together. They identify and measure the cover of all the species. There's a complicated sampling design that includes multiple modules that are 10 meters by 10 meters and a hierarchical plots within each of those modules. The plot itself is centered on the dominant plant community in the wetland. And in some cases, in a complex or large wetland, you need to do multiple IBIs at each site to really reflect that variation in the community. So we started with 122 metrics and reduced that to 3. This, like the other IBIs, has gone through some iterations, but currently there are 3 metrics: the mean coefficient of conservatism, the ratio of forbs to graminoids, and then the relative cover of tolerant species. So some of these metrics reflect kind of the lack of disturbance, and some, like the tolerant species cover, reflect the presence of disturbance. And they're scaled so that we can combine them. Each metric is worth up to 5 points, so there's a maximum score of 15 points, and then that's divided into categories of low, medium, and high, much like the Kentucky RAM is divided into these categories, which are just make it a little easier for use in kind of regulatory situations. And we found with the vegetation IBI that it was strongly related to the disturbance indicator. So after we've kind of pulled together these various metrics, it still reflected the disturbance at the landscape scale. And so it seems to work pretty well. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the avian IBI. So this was developed at 123 sites that also span the entire state and all the different major river basins within the state. It's done with point counts by a skilled bird biologist or a biologist that has bird ID skills. And again, the data from the point count surveys, the abundance and the species presence is used to create metrics that reflect the life history and guilds of the species. And then those guilds are that's kind of weighted by the presence or the abundance of the species. So we started with 90 metrics for the avian IBI. We reduced that to 5 metrics, and those include the percent of resident species, the percent of edge specialist, which are also generalist, the percent of carnivore generalist, which includes insectivores, the percent of multi-brood species, and a measure of the community diversity, the inverse Simpson's index. So again, some of these metrics reflect the absence of disturbance, like the carnivore generalist and the Simpson's inverse diversity, and others reflect the presence of disturbance, like the percent residents, the percent edge specialist. So it's hopefully kind of capturing different functions, and it's looking at kind of a higher trophic level than we do with plants. So again, those metrics are combined, and each one is worth 5 points. And so the total max value for the avian IBI is 25 points, and it can be divided into 3 categories. And like with the vegetation IBI, we see a pattern of that the avian IBI is correlated strongly with this disturbance indicator. So these different categories of the avian IBI reflect a gradient of disturbance. So again, keep in mind that you could potentially do multiple IBIs of these taxonomic groups, and it might tell you different things about the wetland in terms of its condition and its functions. Okay, so last I'll talk real quick about the amphibian IBI. This is the more recent of the intensive assessments that we've developed, and it has been developed with fewer sites, so 66 sites, and it's not yet statewide like the other IBIs that were developed using sites from across the state. So this is in part due to it being pretty difficult to get the data for these amphibian IBIs, at least at enough sites to do a good development process. We also, going into this, did not have C of C values for amphibians, and so as I mentioned before, those were developed as part of this process. The sampling is also complicated in that it requires multiple visits to each site because amphibian breeding patterns span among species much of the year. So, marbled salamanders are breeding in November and December, and bullfrogs in June and July. And so multiple visits are needed to accurately account for the presence of all the possible species. The sampling includes auditory and visual surveys, dip nets, minnow trapping, and again, coming out of that, you have a list of the species that are present and their abundance. Those are combined into, again, lots of metrics, 304 in this case, which were reduced to 6 metrics, which when combined add up to a 30-point maximum. And you can see the metrics include C of C related metrics, community diversity, richness at the family level, and in this case, the presence of plethodonid salamanders, which would indicate it's a relatively high quality, less disturbed wetland. Okay, so to wrap up, I've talked about 3 different levels of assessments that have been developed here in Kentucky. They can be used together or alone. If you're going to use one alone, the starting spot is the Kentucky RAM. It's quick, it's highly, it's validated, and it's similar to methods that are used in other states. It also doesn't require as much expertise in taxonomy like the IBIs do. So with that, I would just say, grab your bucket and get out there and start assessing some wetlands.